The summer sun was blazing down when I first pulled my truck into the long gravel driveway of the house I had just closed on, a sprawling, slightly older, but beautifully maintained two-story place nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood that was defined less by uniformity and more by a sense of individuality. The kind of street where some houses wore their owners' personalities like badges of honor, with quirky mailboxes, vibrant flower beds, and custom porch swings that told you, without a word, that this was a place where people lived freely. Little did I know that right next door lurked a woman who had dedicated every ounce of her life to policing others, enforcing unwritten rules, and assuming authority where she had none, the infamous HOA Karen of this community, who, despite the fact that her homeowners association had jurisdiction only over her side of the development, acted as though she were the mayor, judge, and sheriff of the entire zip code. And when she saw me unloading boxes from the back of my truck, she descended like a hawk swooping on prey, her voice sharp, shrill, and dripping with entitlement as she screeched, "You can't live here. This isn't part of the HOA, and we don't allow outsiders to buy property next to us." I remember blinking in confusion, sweat running down my brow as I balanced a cardboard box of books in my arms, wondering if I'd misheard her, because who on earth yells at a stranger on moving day? But sure enough, she stormed across her manicured lawn, her flip-flops slapping the concrete, her oversized sunglasses perched on her nose like she was some kind of celebrity watchdog, and she pointed at me as though I'd committed a crime, demanding to see my paperwork, insisting I was mistaken, that this parcel is HOA protected. Though I had already done months of due diligence, consulted with real estate attorneys, and knew beyond a shadow of doubt that the property I purchased sat deliberately outside the HOA boundaries, which was one of the main reasons I had chosen it, because I'd grown weary of friends telling me horror stories of getting fined for planting the wrong flowers or painting their door a slightly non-approved shade of beige, and I wanted freedom, the ability to landscape how I pleased, to park my boat in the driveway if I felt like it, to host barbecues without worrying about some committee handing me a notice the next day. Yet here she was, red-faced and trembling with fury, yelling so loud the neighbors began peeking out from their windows, and as I tried to explain calmly that I had purchased the property legally and had every right to live here, she began threatening to call the HOA board, file a complaint with the city, and even call the cops, though none of those things would hold up because the law, the deeds, and the county lines all stood firmly on my side. And yet Karen thrived not on facts but on intimidation, and her entire being seemed fueled by the belief that if she screamed loud enough, people would just cave in to her demands, which perhaps worked on some of the weaker residents within her HOA, but I wasn't one of them. I'd grown up in a rougher part of town where standing your ground was second nature, and though I didn't come looking for a fight, I wasn't about to roll over and surrender my dream home to a stranger's delusions. Still, section 1 of this long story is about how those first encounters, tense and almost absurd, shaped the unfolding war between me, the newcomer determined to exercise his freedom, and her, the self-appointed guardian of conformity, who couldn't stand the idea of a non-HOA neighbor ruining her perfect cul-de-sac. And that first week was a whirlwind of interactions that left me shaking my head at just how far she was willing to go. Because after her initial outburst, she doubled down, approaching me every single day with new rules she claimed I was violating. On Monday, she insisted that the color of my shutters clashed with the aesthetic of a neighborhood. On Tuesday, she accused me of parking my moving van too long on the street. On Wednesday, she claimed that my dog's bark was disturbing the peace, even though he barked only once when she banged on my gate, and through all of it I kept meticulous notes, snapping photos, recording dates and times, because I had the foresight to know this wasn't going to be a one-time annoyance. This was a long campaign she was mounting, and I needed documentation if I was going to defend myself when she inevitably escalated. Meanwhile, I was slowly turning the house into a home, arranging furniture, painting walls, meeting the friendlier neighbors who came over with casseroles or cold drinks, shaking their heads apologetically when I mentioned Karen, saying things like, "Oh, she means well but takes the HOA too seriously," or "Don't let her get to you, she's all bark," though their nervous laughter betrayed that they too had been victims of her policing. And one elderly man down the street even told me he once got a notice because his grandson's bicycle was left on the lawn for more than 3 hours. violation that cost him $50. Hearing stories like that only steeled my resolve, because I realized I wasn't just defending myself, I was standing up against a pattern of bullying that had plagued this community for years, and if I pushed back, maybe others would finally breathe easier. And so, as Section 1 barrels forward, the stage is set. Me, a stubborn but fair homeowner determined to live freely. Her, a domineering HOA Karen whose screams of "you can't live here" would soon evolve into full-blown crusades involving police visits, HOA board meetings, anonymous letters, and even bizarre late-night confrontations. The neighborhood, a divided stage where some secretly cheered me on while others cowered in silence. And above all, the looming question of just how far she was willing to go to force me out, because every time I thought she couldn't get worse, she proved me wrong, and that first summer, as the cicadas buzzed and the heat waves shimmered off the asphalt, I realized that moving next door to her wasn't just a real estate decision, it was the opening volley in a battle of wills that would test my patience, my wit, and my very right to call this house my home. The first week of living next door to Karen had already shown me her claws, but the second week proved beyond a doubt that she was not going to fade into the background like some irritable neighbor you learn to tune out. No, she was escalating, and with each passing day, her obsession with controlling me and my property grew more bizarre, more aggressive, and frankly more comical if it hadn't been so disruptive, because from the moment I woke up to the sound of her shrill voice calling across the fence to the moment I lay in bed at night, hearing her slam doors and mutter loudly on purpose about outsiders ruining the community, my life was entangled with hers, and it became clear that this battle was not about rules or laws, or even the HOA she clung to like a badge of honor. It was about power, about her desperate need to dictate how other people lived, as though my independence threatened the very foundation of her identity. And so section 2 of this saga begins with the morning. I caught her trespassing in my yard, clipboard in hand, tape measure dangling from her wrist, snapping photos of my backyard like she was conducting an official inspection, except there was nothing official about it. I came out with my coffee and nearly spilled it when I saw her squatting by my fence line, measuring the distance from the wood to my flower bed, muttering about setbacks and ordinances as though she were the county zoning commissioner, and when I cleared my throat, she nearly leapt out of her flip-flops, spinning around with that guilty-turned-indignant expression only Karen seemed to master, and she barked that she was within her rights as an HOA officer to ensure compliance, to which I calmly reminded her yet again that my house wasn't in her HOA, her rules didn't apply here, and if she didn't get off my property immediately I'd call the actual police. But instead of backing down, she doubled her volume and screamed, "Then I'll call them first. We'll see what they say about you breaking community standards," which sent the whole neighborhood into a spectacle as blinds lifted and curtains twitched, neighbors peeking out to see the morning showdown, and she stormed away only after I pulled out my phone and began recording her, huffing that she'd have me gone by the end of the month. That incident set the tone for the weeks to follow, because true to her word, she began a relentless campaign to remove me, filing complaints not only with her HOA board, which sent me a laughable letter reminding me of rules that held no authority over my parcel, but also with the City Code Enforcement Office, the county assessor, and even the police, none of which stuck because my paperwork was airtight, but each time some poor public employee knocked on my door apologetically, telling me they'd just received a complaint and needed to check, it drained more of my time, cost me more patience, and made me realize Karen wasn't just annoying. She was strategic, using bureaucracy like a weapon, and I had to be smarter if I wanted to win. So I started compiling a thicker file, printing every notice she sent, saving every voicemail she left, cataloging every incident with date, time, and witness statements from kind neighbors who sympathized, because deep down I knew this would eventually end up in a courtroom or at least a hearing. And when that day came, I wanted to walk in with a binder so heavy the judge would need both hands to flip through it. Meanwhile, Karen's antics grew more theatrical, like the evening she stood at the edge of her driveway with a bullhorn. Yes, an actual bullhorn, announcing to anyone within earshot that my house devalued the community and that non-HOA properties were a blight on the neighborhood, which made several people across the street burst into laughter, but also embarrassed me because, as much as I wanted to ignore her, I didn't enjoy being the center of a circus, yet I refused to let her win by moving out or showing weakness. So instead, I invited friends over for a barbecue that very weekend, filling my driveway with cars, laughter, and the smell of sizzling ribs, which sent Karen into a frenzy as she ran around taking photos and shouting about unauthorized gatherings, only for my guests to cheerfully wave and ask if she wanted a plate, which she obviously refused. Retreating into her fortress of blinds and binoculars, it was in those moments, watching her unravel over things she couldn't control, that I realized the true irony. She was more trapped by her obsession than I would ever be by her rules, because while I could live freely, she lived shackled to the need to control, and it ate her alive every time she failed, which was every single day I remained next door. But still, the tension built because the HOA board itself soon got involved, sending a delegation of 3 members, 2 meek, nervous retirees, and 1 stiff man in a polo shirt, to my doorstep with clipboards, politely but firmly trying to discuss my violations. And when I explained that I was outside their jurisdiction, they looked genuinely baffled, as though Karen had never told them that simple fact. And after I showed them my deed, they left in embarrassment, muttering about miscommunication, which should have ended it, but instead enraged Karen further. And that very night, she plastered flyers across the neighborhood claiming I was a danger to community standards and urging people to sign a petition demanding the city annex my property into the HOA, an idea so ludicrous even her closest allies whispered that she had gone too far, and yet, like a storm gathering momentum, her madness hadn't peaked. She was only getting started, and as Section 2 closes, the neighborhood itself is beginning to split into factions. Those who silently endure her because they fear her retaliation, and those who quietly root for me to stand my ground, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if I weather her wrath long enough, I'd finally be the one to break her hold over them all. By the time the 3rd month of living next door to Karen rolled around, the situation had morphed from a nuisance into an outright battlefront, a kind of suburban Cold War, where every move I made seemed to trigger some new scheme on her part. And while I had initially thought her antics would fizzle out after exhausting themselves against the wall of my legal rights, I quickly realized I had underestimated her persistence. Because Karen was not a woman who gave up easily, she was a woman who lived for the fight, who thrived on conflict the way others thrive on hobbies, and so every morning I woke up not wondering if she'd try something new but what form her attack would take, and it ranged from the petty, like when she left a passive-aggressive welcome to the HOA community packet taped to my front door filled with pages of rules highlighted in yellow as though she were my landlord, to the absurdly hostile, like the afternoon I came home to find bright orange cones blocking my driveway, and Karen standing in the middle of it with her arms crossed, claiming she had declared it a construction zone until I fixed my fence, which wasn't broken in the first place, and I had to call the actual police to move her off my property, much to the quiet amusement of the neighbors who watch from their porches. But Section 3 is also where the story takes a darker and more strategic turn, because Karen, having failed with her HOA board, failed with city code complaints, and failed with her daily harassment, now decided to wage psychological warfare, filling my mailbox with anonymous letters that dripped with venomous language, typed in all caps as though rage alone could compel me to surrender, letters that said things like, "You don't belong here, and we will drive you out," which might have shaken someone else, but only made me laugh, because the anonymity was a thin veil. Who else in this neighborhood would care enough to threaten me in 12-point times? New Roman font, but the woman glaring at me through her blinds every morning. Still, I saved every single one of those letters, sliding them into my growing binder of evidence, because I knew one day they'd come in handy, and in the meantime I decided to fight fire with sunlight. So I began talking openly to other neighbors, not just the few who had already shown support, but the quieter ones, the ones Karen had cowed into silence over the years, and what I discovered was a gold mine of resentment. Stories of fines over garden gnomes, notices about trash bins visible from the street for more than 15 minutes, letters shaming them for parking too many cars during holiday gatherings, and slowly, cautiously, They began to realize that I wasn't just some stubborn outsider. I was a neighbor willing to stand up to the tyrant they'd been tiptoeing around for years, and in whispered conversations on front lawns and at backyard fences, they began to encourage me to tell me they were rooting for me, and that subtle shift in energy only enraged Karen further, because nothing threatened her power more than the idea of others realizing she could be defied. So she escalated again, this time staging a dramatic community emergency meeting in her driveway, complete with folding chairs lined up in rows, a megaphone, and a printed agenda that included items like dealing with unauthorized neighbor and preserving HOA integrity. And though I wasn't invited, I watched from my porch as maybe a dozen residents reluctantly attended, some rolling their eyes, some too polite to refuse, and Karen stood before them like a general rallying her troops, ranting about how I was lowering property values and setting a dangerous precedent by refusing to conform, until one brave man, a retired teacher named Mr. Dawson, stood up and asked the question that silenced the whole gathering. Karen, why do you care so much about someone else's property when it isn't even under the HOA? And the look on her face, that split second of being challenged publicly, was priceless, a mixture of fury and disbelief that someone dared question her authority. But instead of answering, she turned it back on him, accusing him of being in cahoots with the outsider, which only made more people frown. And though the meeting fizzled into awkward murmurs, it marked a turning point, because the cracks in her influence were beginning to show. Of course, Karen didn't take humiliation well, and that very night, she banged on my door at nearly midnight, demanding I stop turning the neighbors against her, and threatening to sue me for defamation, a threat so empty I nearly laughed in her face. But instead, I calmly told her that if she didn't leave my property immediately, I'd add trespassing to the growing list of her offenses, and I shut the door while she was still shouting, her fists pounding like a drumbeat of desperation. But as exhausting as her antics were, Section 3 ends on a note of resolve for me, because by this point I had realized that this wasn't just about me keeping my house, it was about breaking the cycle of fear she had built in this neighborhood, about showing the others that she could be stood up to. And while the battle was far from over, I could sense momentum shifting ever so slightly in my favor, the first small victories in a war that would only grow more dramatic in the weeks to come. If the first 3 sections of the story were a slow burn of harassment, intimidation, and neighborhood drama, then Section 4 is where the storm finally broke open into a full-scale war, because by this point Karen was no longer content with passive-aggressive notes, HOA flyers, or late-night shouting matches. She wanted action, something concrete she could use to prove to herself and everyone else that she was still in control, and so she began concocting increasingly elaborate schemes that went beyond mere annoyance into dangerous territory, starting with the day I came home from work to find that someone had spray painted "Get Out" in sloppy red letters across my garage door. The kind of vandalism so juvenile it would have been laughable if it weren't also a crime. And though I had security cameras that captured a hooded figure scurrying across my driveway in the middle of the night, the gate, the build, the unmistakable clumsy shuffle all screamed Karen, even if she had the foresight to cover her face. And when I showed the footage to the police, they shook their heads and said it wasn't enough to make an arrest, though they promised to file a report, which only deepened my resolve to protect myself more thoroughly. So I installed brighter floodlights, upgraded my cameras, and even put up a tall privacy fence around the backyard, which of course drove her insane, because the construction crew spent 3 days hammering and drilling, making noise she couldn't approve, and she spent those days pacing along her side of the property line, shouting things like, "You can't block community visibility, and that fence isn't regulation height," despite the fact that county code allowed every inch of it, and when it was finished, a beautiful cedar barrier that gave me peace and blocked her nosy stares. I celebrated with another barbecue, inviting half the block, which turned into the biggest gathering the street had seen in years, kids running around, with sparklers, adults laughing and clinking beer bottles, music drifting across the summer night, and for the first time I saw true joy on the faces of neighbors who had spent too long under her shadow, their relief almost tangible as they realized we could have fun without worrying about HOA notices. But of course Karen saw it differently. storming out onto her driveway with her phone recording, narrating like a deranged newscaster about how illegal activities were happening next door, screaming into her camera about fire hazards and noise pollution, only to trip on the edge of her lawn and tumble into her own hedge, which sent the entire party into hysterics, though I made sure no one helped her until she demanded it, flustered and red-faced, storming back inside and slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Still, her humiliation only fueled her vengeance, and the very next week, I received notice that she had filed an official civil complaint accusing me of creating a public nuisance and endangering property values, which meant I now had a court date, exactly what I had been preparing for with my ever-growing binder of evidence. And though some people might have panicked, I felt almost exhilarated because this was the battleground I wanted, a place where facts mattered, where her lies and tantrums would finally be weighed against reality. And so I spent nights organizing my files, printing photos of her trespassing, transcribing her late night rants I had recorded, even collecting witness statements from neighbors who were more than happy to describe her harassment. And by the time the hearing date arrived, I walked into that small courthouse with a stack of documents so thick it barely fit in my arms, while Karen strutted in with nothing but her righteous indignation and a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, glaring at me like I was a criminal. But when the judge asked for evidence, she had none, only claims and complaints. While I calmly laid out a timeline of every stunt she had pulled since the day I moved in, backing it up with photos, recordings, and signed statements. And I'll never forget the moment the judge leaned back in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and told her plainly that she had no authority over my property, that her HOA had no jurisdiction, and that any further harassment could result in legal penalties against her. A statement so final and cutting it drained the color from her face, and though she tried to sputter back some excuse, the gavel came down and the matter was closed, the ruling firmly in my favor. And as we left the courtroom, I could feel the shift in the air, the murmurs of neighbors who had come to watch, the way their eyes lit up as they realized Karen had finally lost, truly and undeniably for the first time in years. Yet, as satisfying as the victory was, I knew in my gut it wasn't the end, because people like her don't accept defeat. Gracefully, they don't retreat. Quietly, they double down. And sure enough, that very night, as I sat on my porch sipping a celebratory beer, I saw her blinds twitching, her silhouette pacing furiously, and I knew she was plotting her next move, because section for may have delivered a courtroom triumph. But it also set the stage for the fiercest phase of this battle, the one where Karen, stripped of her official weapons, would turn to desperation and chaos in her final attempt to drive me out. By the time the courtroom dust had settled and I walked back into my neighborhood with the judge's ruling still echoing in my head, I naively thought perhaps Karen would finally simmer down, maybe lick her wounds in silence, maybe even learn to coexist, if not exactly in peace, then at least in a cold truce. But I should have known better, because Karen was not wired to retreat, she was wired to escalate, and losing in court did not deflate her. It ignited her like pouring gasoline on a smoldering ember, and what followed was a campaign so bizarre, so desperate, and so relentless it felt less like suburban drama and more like psychological warfare straight out of movie, beginning with her late-night patrols, where she would wander the street with a flashlight, muttering loudly about keeping watch and deliberately shining the beam into my windows to disrupt my sleep, and when I called out asking what she thought she was doing, she would snap back, making sure you're not violating noise ordinances. At 3 in the morning, mind you, and when even that didn't provoke me into a confrontation, she escalated further, calling animal control on my perfectly healthy dog, who was eventually declared the picture of good care by the officer who came to inspect, and when that failed, she started filing noise complaints with the police about constant parties at my house, even though most evenings I was alone watching TV, and though the officers grew increasingly apologetic about having to show up, they admitted they had to check every complaint, which wasted my time but also built a thicker file for me, every report another nail in the coffin of her credibility. But Karen wasn't finished, because the more her official routes failed, the more unhinged her tactics became. Like the afternoon I came home to find dozens of plastic flamingos jammed into my lawn with notes tied around their necks that read HOA required and join or leave. A prank so ridiculous I laughed until my ribs hurt. though I also kept one flamingo as a trophy, a monument to her absurdity, and when she saw it still standing on my porch the next day, she nearly combusted with rage, screaming from her driveway that I was mocking her, which of course I was. Still, her determination was unmatched, and soon she turned her focus back on the neighbors, going door to door with petitions, trying to rally them against me, spinning stories about how I was lowering property values and bringing in dangerous outsiders. But the tide had already turned. People were tired of her constant meddling, and more they began to side with me openly, inviting me to their gatherings, waving at me as they ignored her, some even telling her to her face that enough was enough, which drove her to one final desperate stunt that marked the peak of her madness, staging what she called a community protest directly in front of my house, complete with homemade signs reading an O. Outsiders save our HOA. And this is our street, though only 3 other people showed up, 2 of them relatives she had roped in from outside the neighborhood. And they stood there chanting weakly while I mowed my lawn in full view, earbuds in, pretending not to hear, which only enraged her further until she stormed onto my property and tried to block my mower, at which point I calmly parked it, pulled out my phone, and began recording as she shrieked about illegal landscaping. The video later going viral after one of the younger neighbors uploaded it with the caption Karen versus lawnmower, a clip that spread far beyond our street and turned her into an online laughingstock. Though she didn't yet realize the extent of her newfound infamy, and so Section 5 crescendos with the image of Karen unraveling in front of the whole world, her power over the neighborhood crumbling, her reputation shredded by her own behavior. While I stood firmer than ever, no longer just a homeowner defending his property, but a symbol for every neighbor she had bullied for years, and though I knew she wasn't done, people like her never quit without a final act. I also knew that whatever storm she tried to summon in Section 6, she could no longer win, because the neighborhood, the law, and even the internet itself had all turned against her, leaving her isolated in a fortress of blinds and bitterness, plotting her last desperate move. By the time Section 6 unfolds, the neighborhood had shifted so dramatically that even I could feel the difference in the air. Where once there had been nervous whispers behind drawn blinds, now there was open laughter at Karen's antics. Where once she had commanded fear, now she only provoked eye rolls. And where once I had stood alone in the crosshairs of her obsessive crusade, now I had an entire street of allies who were as tired of her tyranny as I was. But of course, true to form, Karen could not accept her downfall quietly. She could not retreat into the background and live like a normal neighbor. She needed one final act, one grand attempt to claw back the control that had slipped from her fingers, and so she launched her ultimate scheme, filing a full-blown lawsuit not just against me, but against the county, claiming that the deed to my property was invalid, that the lines had been drawn wrong, and that my house should fall under HOA jurisdiction, a claim so absurd it might have been dismissed outright, if not for the fact that she hired a shady lawyer willing to take her money, which forced the county and me to respond formally, dragging the entire matter into a courtroom once more. But this time it wasn't a simple hearing. It was a proper trial with evidence, witnesses, and weeks of preparation, and while Karen strutted around the neighborhood boasting that she was taking me down for good and restoring order, I quietly worked with my attorney gathering every deed, plat map, survey, and title history available, building an airtight case that would not only shut her down, but expose her for the nuisance she truly was. And when the trial began, the courtroom was packed, half the neighborhood turning out just to see it, some bringing snacks as if it were theater, because in a way it was Karen on the stand, gesticulating wildly, presenting doctored maps she had printed from the internet, ranting about community integrity while the judge grew, visibly impatient, and then my turn, calmly presenting original certified documents, county records dating back 50 years, professional surveys with seals and signatures, and finally my thick binder of harassment evidence, page after page of her letters, her trespasses, her videos, even the viral lawnmower incident. And as the jury flipped through it all, their expressions shifted from disbelief to outright amusement, because it was clear who was telling the truth and who was spinning delusions. And in the end, the verdict came swiftly, the judge ruling in my favor, so Decisively, he added a restraining order against Karen, barring her from coming within 50 feet of my property, threatening her with heavy fines if she ever harassed me again. And the moment that gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in applause, not just for me, but for the symbolic victory over years of her dictatorship, the sound echoing like thunder in Karen's ears as she sat pale and trembling, her empire of control finally crumbling in front of everyone she had once dominated. Yet the true final blow came not from the judge, but from the internet, because by then her reputation as HOA Karen had spread far beyond our street, with millions of views on the videos, memes popping up, even local news running a segment about her failed crusade. And for someone who had built her entire life around the illusion of authority and respect, becoming a public punchline was unbearable, so unbearable that within weeks a moving truck pulled into her driveway, and without a single goodbye, she vanished. Her house sold quietly to a young couple who, upon hearing the stories, thanked me for paving the way for them to enjoy the neighborhood in peace. And so Section 6 ends not just with my personal victory, but with a neighborhood transformed, freed from the chokehold of a woman who thought she could control everything. Now alive with the sound of kids playing, barbecues sizzling, neighbors chatting openly, without fear of fines or notices. And as I sit on my porch in the evenings, beer in hand, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, I reflect on how close I came to losing my dream home to someone else's madness, how easy it would have been to give up and move out. But how much sweeter it feels to know that by standing firm, by documenting, by refusing to cave, I not only kept my house, but helped liberate an entire street from years of oppression. And the greatest irony of all is that in the end, Karen was right about one thing. I didn't belong in her HOA. I belonged outside of it where freedom lives, where individuality thrives, and where no self-appointed tyrant can ever again scream, "You can't live here," and think they have the power to make it true.